Welcome to On Health with Houston Methodist. I'm Zach Moore. I'm a photographer and editor here, and I've worked in multimedia and television for over 15 years, and I'm also a longtime podcaster.
I'm Katie McCallum. I'm a former researcher turned health writer, mostly writing for our blog.
And Katie, how much bread do you think you eat every week?
I would say probably a pretty average amount. I think we probably end up putting bread in our grocery cart. Not every week, but every other week. We use it mostly for toast in the morning, I would say.
Good choice.
Yeah, toast, sandwiches at lunch, super easy. I'm a huge fan of a peanut butter and jelly. In fact, I have one for breakfast sometimes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like with toast, you toast the bread and then peanut butter and jelly. So yeah, I mean, I think I eat probably an average amount. How about you, Zach?
I feel like I eat too much bread.
Well, I would say an average amount might actually be too much bread as well here, since we overeat on a lot of things.
Right. Toast is great. Sandwiches, croutons.
Oh man, I love croutons. Do you know what I started doing?
What?
You did that episode on air fryers back in season 2. I actually now buy little tiny baguettes. You can buy those little small baguettes, and I slice them up.
Make your own croutons.
I make my own croutons in the air fryer. You just lightly toss them in olive oil and some Italian seasoning, put them in the air fryer. I'm not kidding. You'll never buy packaged croutons ever again.
Interesting. I might have to try this.
Try it. It's like you literally, or sometimes I'll snack on them now, which is dangerous.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Sometimes I snack on croutons and I'm making salads and I just got my crouton bag here. I'm going to have a couple, and it's probably too much bread. So if you can think about that, right? I mean, you eat breakfast, lunch, dinner, not to mention if you eat pasta, you're going to make garlic bread.
Yeah.
You're just going to eat a lot of bread. And bread probably has a bad reputation these days when people are trying to be quote unquote healthy.
Yeah.
One of the first things you hear is, oh, you got to cut out bread.
Yeah. We live in a very carbs are the enemy world. We did that with fats, I think a while ago. I don't really hear as much with fats anymore about how awful they are, but carbs for sure. And bread's the most obvious carb. The thought when you're losing weight is, I'm going to cut down on the bread. But it kind of does make you wonder if bread's as bad as we're all making it out to be. Is bread the problem?
We're the problem.
Or are we the problem?
Well, who'd we talk to today about this, Katie?
Today, we talked to Kylie Arrindell. She's a dietitian here at Houston Methodist. And we talked to her about bread generally. But I think most importantly, we talk about the bread aisle, how to navigate the bread aisle. We have a lot of choices for a lot of different products. I don't think there's a single type of food that has its own aisle quite like bread does. There's literally nothing else on the bread aisle except for bread.
Okay. Good point. I never thought of those terms.
Water, there's water and sparkling water maybe on a side of the aisle. Bread is literally just every bread option imaginable on one side, bread adjacent stuff on the other side. It's incredibly complicated to navigate, on top of the fact that we're often hearing, oh, bread's the bad guy.
Yeah, and we had a great time talking to Kylie a couple seasons ago about avocado toast, which is another form of bread. So check out that episode if you haven't already. And we're going to talk about more variations of bread and toast in our conversation with her today.
Yeah, let's get this bread. All right, well, we're here with Kylie Arrindell, dietitian at Houston Methodist. Welcome, Kylie.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Welcome back, I should say, actually. We had you on in season 1 for an episode about avocado toast, which actually is what inspired this episode today on bread. Bread is a staple, and I think most people's diets, definitely a staple of a grocery cart. I think at least once a month, we're all trying to pick out some sort of bread option, whether it's sliced bread or some rolls. And I think what we want to talk about today is how complicated and overwhelming and challenging it is to walk through the bread aisle and feel like you've come out making a healthy decision, I would say.
Yes, very overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to run some numbers by you and our listeners just to paint the scene here. I opened my app for a very popular grocery store here in Houston, and I checked out the bread section, and there are 164 sliced bread options.
Wow.
88 bun and roll options. 34 bagel options, 24 English muffin options, and I stopped there because already we're entering the 200 plus territory.
Yeah,
I think.
Is that including frozen section too, or
I
just
think it probably does. Actually, that's a good point. It probably does, the frozen garlic bread.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, but it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for someone like me, and I mean, I'm interested to get your take, even as an expert in nutrition. How do you make any sense of the amount of options we have these days?
It's crazy because it's not just bread, it's yogurt or any kind of dairy product. And then you've got nuts, seeds, beans, all kinds of stuff. I mean, the consumer wants choice, and they definitely have it. So it is really hard to kind of figure out what is going to make the most sense for you from a health perspective, and also your taste preferences. There's a lot that goes into that for sure.
Yeah. And I guess the first place to start with bread, or at least where I think we can start, and this is a huge question, so we'll chip away at it. We want to talk about where bread falls in a healthy diet. And I guess my first question is, bread often gets a bad rap, especially when we're thinking about weight loss. I think everything I've ever heard about weight loss is like the carb phobic, like get rid of the bread, never eat another slice of bread. I mean, just to start, like, is bread unhealthy?
That's a loaded question, but I definitely think it's important to talk about. So it's sort of wild how much bread is vilified. It's hard to say where specifically bread kind of went wrong, but I think it has a lot to do with the types of breads that Americans or most Americans consume. A blanket statement of all carbs are inherently bad for us is just simply not true, and it can actually be kind of dangerous. So bread being a carbohydrate doesn't really help its case in the public's eye.
Are there some types of bread that are like quote unquote worse than others maybe? And, the bread aisle has more than just sliced bread. And so I read something somewhere on the internet, so correct me if this is wrong, that eating a bagel is the equivalent of eating 6 slices of bread. So is that where are there any like bread aisle watchouts that you would say, like, I know we shouldn't say don't eat, like never stop eating something, but like put your red flags up and maybe that's a every now and then item.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you're talking about serving sizes, so a bagel is technically, depending on what kind of bagel, between 2 and 4 servings of a carbohydrate. Gosh. So that's where that kind of gets that. Is it equivalent to 4 slices of bread? 6 is a lot. I haven't heard of the 6 specifically, but it is a higher carbohydrate containing food than just one piece of sliced bread. So you do have to be careful with some of those products. But also your cinnamon rolls and other packaged types of products, those may not be as volume-wise big or have as much volume to them, but they still can have just as many carbohydrates, if not more, than the bagel or the other pieces of sliced bread.
Got it. And when you mentioned that a bagel can be like 2 to 4 servings of carbohydrates per like sitting meal, like for breakfast, like how many servings of carbohydrates is too many? I know you're probably like, these are so hard to answer.
No, it's okay. It sort of depends on the person. So if you are somebody who might have some blood sugar concerns, then maybe you don't want to have as many carbohydrates servings at once than somebody who maybe doesn't have those blood sugar concerns. So it might look like 3 to 4 servings for somebody who has type 2 diabetes. And for somebody who doesn't, they could maybe get away with 4 to 5. It really depends on what else you're eating with it. You don't want to just consume a huge carbohydrate-rich meal and have no other macronutrients in that meal.
The bakery section of a grocery store, it's not the bread aisle, but it's a competitor to the bread aisle almost, in that, I can get my sliced bread from the bakery section or I can get it from the bread aisle. Type for type. So like, let's say I want some sliced sourdough. Is there any benefit to me going to the bakery and getting, some sliced sourdough that's fresh scratch made? Or is that packaged sliced sourdough about the same? Can you talk us through those decisions?
Sure. A scratch-made sourdough is a great option, not just for taste. It's kind of has a different taste to it, but it also has probiotics in it. So sourdough is a fermented food, so it can actually be really helpful for your gut. And it can also be a good option for people who have trouble digesting some other bread products. But to say it's better or worse than packaged bread is kind of a loaded question. It's kind of hard. It just depends on the person who's buying it and the actual bread that you're looking at. A homemade Asiago or a croissant of some sort is going to be a less nutrient-rich choice than 100% whole wheat bread that you find in the bread aisle.
Okay. Croissants are getting the downvote here.
Unfortunately.
They're unfortunately the most delicious thing that's probably on this planet, so that makes sense. I think probably saw that coming. So when we get into, I guess, all types of bread, but in my mind, I think sliced bread. The 2 categories that I immediately think of, there's obviously a ton of options. We mentioned 164 options.
Yes.
There's a lot in there, but the 2 main categories in my mind I think of is like white bread and then, the brown bread that's either it's maybe whole grain, it's maybe whole wheat. I don't know. We're going to talk about that. What's the difference between white bread and brown bread as far as our health goes?
There could be 50 differences between white bread and brown bread.
Wow.
The kind of bread, the way it's made, the ingredients they used or didn't use for that particular product. That being said, a lot of the color relates to the type of grain that's used. So whether that's whole grains or refined grains in that product. So that could definitely be one of the differences between the white and the brown bread.
Okay. And so when we're talking about whole grains versus refined grains, if you had to choose which one someone would pick, I mean, I kind of feel like I know the answer, but just so we're very clear, what kind of bread do you want someone choosing when it comes to whole grain or refined?
Definitely whole grains.
Okay.
Whole grains are associated with a lower risk for cardiovascular disease. They're helpful for people who have type 2 diabetes. They also are extremely beneficial for our gut health. And it's a staple of the Mediterranean diet, which is year over year voted the overall best diet from US News and World Report.
Got it. And then white bread or breads made with refined grains or flours, what's the downside of those? Or do they have any benefits, maybe, is the first question. And then what's the list of downsides?
Yeah, so the benefit to those is that it typically has a longer shelf life. So it's helpful for a lot of packaged products and those types of things. But it's stripped of some of the important components of the whole grain kernel. So it typically is missing 1 or 2 out of the 3. So your whole grains are going to have all 3 parts of the kernel still intact or still a part of that grain. So you're going to get more fiber, you're going to get more nutrients, you're going to get more protein too, versus the refined flours or refined grains that have been stripped of those nutrients. They have to actually be added back in to get the benefit of them.
So it sounds like really the white bread came about for shelf life reasons
and like mass production.
Okay.
And honestly, if you want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and you want it on white bread, that has a certain kind of nostalgia to it. And it also, you're having a fluffy piece of white bread, and a lot of consumers want that fluffy factor to their bread products.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't even think about that. That is probably one of the things about whole grain breads that it's like they're like firmer, I guess I would say. Yeah. So, okay, that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I wanted to touch on before we move on is, I know in our previous podcast episode about avocado toast, you'd mentioned that the color of the bread's not always the best indicator sometimes, because there are ways to make a bread that's, perhaps just white bread or usually a white bread to make it look like a brown bread and a healthier bread. As someone trying to just make it down the bread aisle, talk us through like this level of deception and what we need to know and how to not pick up that bread.
That's a very fair question. So I don't think that bread companies are trying to mislead the consumer per se, but it does go to show you that you do need to check the nutrition facts label and the ingredients list. The appearance of brown bread tends to have a healthier connotation to it than white bread. It's also associated with like a better palatability. So think of like a cinnamon roll when it's baking, it has that kind of brown toasty looking color to it. It's more appetizing. So whether it be for the healthier option or this is more appetizing, whatever fits the bill for that particular company, they may need to incorporate a browner looking product. They can do that with sugar. They can do that with other types of additives like caramel color. So there can be some added things that don't necessarily need to be in there, making it look like a browner piece of bread.
So when we're talking about sliced bread, the options that are brown that we think are healthy, I've heard you say whole grain, and I've seen the words whole and I've seen the words grain on a bunch of those 164 options. What is truly whole grain? There's multigrain, there's 7 grain, there's 12 grain, there's sprouted grain. How do we know if what we're picking up is actually whole grain?
The only way to tell is to look at the ingredients list. So you want to see the word whole in front of any type of grain that particular bread is claiming to have. So whole grain doesn't always mean whole wheat. You could have a bread that's made with barley or sorghum or millet even. So that could be a whole grain in itself, and you're looking for the words whole in front of any of those grains.
Okay, so if a bread says whole wheat, and I turn it over and the first thing is not whole wheat, it is not a whole grain bread.
Correct.
Okay. Is that pretty common?
Usually not. Now we have the whole grain stamp that's from the Whole Grains Council. So if you have a product that's claiming to be made with whole grains, they actually have to meet a certain criteria of grams per serving. So that's helpful. So that's another way you can really quickly decide if it has a whole grain stamp on the front. It might, or it probably is going to be a really good option.
Okay, great. Any other claims on bread, whether good or bad, you would say to look out for? Or there's some claims, like, sounds like if we see a whole grain stamp, we can be like, okay, good option, let me pull it. Are there any claims on them that you're like, oh, this is a little misleading, like doesn't really mean anything? They're just putting that to get you to pick it up?
Not necessarily claims, but I think this kind of goes back to one of your other questions of carbohydrates getting a bad rap and sugar getting a bad rap. I do have a lot of clients that tell me, oh, I don't eat that bread product, or I don't eat this because it has X amount of sugar per serving. And that's not exactly the whole story. So if you're looking for a bread product, don't just look at the amount of sugar that it has in there. Look at the total carbohydrates, look at the fiber content, look at the protein content, and look at the amount of added sugars that's actually in that serving. And that is a better way to decipher if that's a good product or not versus just the total sugars.
Okay. And I'm glad you brought up the added sugars, because as I talk to, you and other dietitians I've been clued into the fact that there's a lot of added sugars in things where you might not expect. When we're looking at bread, I think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, added sugars in bread almost always.
It's rare that there's 0 grams of added sugar in a bread product. You're probably going to find 1 to 3 grams in most bread products.
Okay. What's your cutoff for if a bread product has this many grams per serving? Like, it's not like, let's try to put that one down and pick up one that has this amount.
I would say the highest I would go is 3 grams. If you're looking for like a cinnamon roll or a sticky bun or something like that, it's going to be really hard to find a 3 gram or less. But for sliced bread, I would say 1 to 2 grams is okay. It does affect the flavor and the texture of the bread when you have less sugar involved in the process. But you don't necessarily need sugar 100% of the time to make a good bread product.
Kylie mentioned choosing a whole grain bread requires looking at the ingredients list and looking for the word whole in front of whatever type of grain is used. If it's not there, it's not a whole grain option. This step is crucial, since even something that looks or sounds healthy might not check out. For instance, when looking at an option labeled Essential Grains 12 grain bread, sounds pretty healthy, right? I noticed the first ingredient was enriched wheat flour. While the word wheat may sound promising, it's not preceded by the word whole, so this isn't a whole grain option. This is actually the same first ingredient as an option labeled split top butter bread, which definitely doesn't sound or look particularly healthy. But when looking at an option labeled 100% whole wheat, I saw the first ingredient was whole wheat flour. That checks out. If you're choosing a particular bread, assuming it's healthy just by its color or label, consider flipping the package over and putting it to the test just to be sure.
Kylie's covered where bread fits in on the health spectrum and given us tips for making healthier bread choices. Up after the break, we cover a few more questions you may have asked yourself while standing in the bread aisle, including whether the crust is really the healthiest part of a slice of bread, if corn tortillas are really healthier than flour ones, and if it's bad to eat a sandwich every single day for lunch.
From annual checkups to managing chronic conditions, your healthcare should be personalized to you. At Houston Methodist, our primary care doctors provide customized care for you and your family, with more than 40 convenient locations across Greater Houston. We offer a variety of ways to get care, from in-person and virtual appointments to same-day visits when you're sick. Choose your doctor and schedule online at houstonmethodist.org/stayhealthy. Houston Methodist, leading medicine.
And we're back with Kylie Arrindell. We've got a pretty good landscape now of how to navigate the basics of the bread aisle. Look for whole grain options, flip the bag over, make sure it says whole in front of whatever that first ingredient is. There's a ton of types of bread. And we've said that several times. I'm going to pick out a couple, cherry pick a few that I think are either most confusing or popular. And I think maybe we need to talk about. One is just for my own personal edification real quick.
Okay.
If I'm choosing an English muffin over a biscuit, am I making the healthier choice?
Most of the time, yes.
Okay.
The English muffin is going to have a little bit less calories, a little bit less fat than most traditional biscuits. And if you can get a whole grain English muffin, that's even better.
Okay. Cool. Sometimes I just wonder if I'm making these healthy decisions for no reason. Because I know
every little bit counts for sure.
Well, that's great to hear because I think, it's so funny, like brown rice over white rice. Like there's all these little choices you make that it doesn't taste as good. So you're like, am I doing this for a good reason? Is this worth it? So
completely understandable.
Good to hear for myself and any other English muffin choosers. Whole grain English muffin.
Yes.
Vote of confidence. Okay.
Vote of confidence.
Another quick question for you. Crustless bread. I think I at least heard growing up that I needed to eat the crust because, it had tons of nutrients in it. And if I didn't eat the crust, I was missing out. Is this just something our parents told us so we wouldn't waste food, or is that real?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the crust is the area of the bread that is exposed most to the heat during the baking process. So it sometimes comes out crispier or a little bit drier, and that's not as appealing to some people. There's not a significant amount of nutrients that is different from the crust to the middle part of the loaf. So you're better off eating all of it so you get all the fiber per serving and all the nutrients per serving.
Got it. I like the crust, actually.
I'm a big crust girl.
Yeah, I'm a crust fan. I know most people aren't, or I hear a lot of people buy the crustless bread, and I'm just like, I don't know. I enjoy the crust.
Yeah, me
especially
too.
on pizza. The best part of pizza for sure.
I agree.
Next question. Potato bread. I feel like it's becoming kind of like a popular option, particularly, when I'm getting a burger, I often see it's a potato bun. And in my mind, when I think about it, I'm like, oh, potato, probably healthier. But then I'm also wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if it's actually a less healthier way to consume bread. So what's the take on potato bread?
So it's kind of the same as in the chip aisle. You have the veggie straws and those types of things. A lot of different plants can be made into flours, and then you can make any kind of bread product you want, whether that's a bun or chips or whatever the case. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's healthier. It's still a good option for flavor purposes, but it's most likely going to be more so in the refined grain category than the whole grain category in terms of benefit.
Okay, got it. Another question for you. I saw this type of bread when I was researching all these options, and I had never seen this before. Plant-based bread. I dug into it because I was like, okay, grain is as a plant. So
Sure
of course, all bread's plant-based. But then, on the label, they're contains no animal products. Do breads contain animal products often?
Usually not.
Okay. I was like, what could possibly be in there?
Yeah, unless it's being made with some type of butter or some other type of kind of additive, then it could be made with some animal products. But most always it's going to be yeast, flour, water, salt. That's kind of the main staple of bread.
Okay, got it. Of all of the varieties of non-white breads, I think the one that's tripped me up the most the past is multigrain. What on earth does that mean?
That's a very good question. So multigrain really just means that the bread product was made with multiple grains. It does not mean that they're all whole grains that were used in the product. So again, look at the label, see all of the different grains that are in there, and make sure you see the word whole in front of all of those grains.
Okay, perfect. Another quick question for you. Bread aisle adjacent. It's in the bread aisle. So not bread aisle adjacent. In the bread aisle, but, sliced bread adjacent. Tortillas. I think we often talk about whether we should order corn or flour. You and I have actually done a blog post on this, and I think it's very apt to address it on this podcast. Corn versus flour. Am I making a healthier choice when I pick up the corn tortillas instead of the flour ones?
Not always. Depends on how many tortillas you're going to be using for that particular taco or whatever you're making.
It's a great pro tip.
Yes. But I would say the better choice of both of those is going to be a whole wheat tortilla, since we're talking about whole grains already.
After we did that blog post, I switched to whole wheat tortillas.
Oh my gosh. I'm so proud.
Yeah. I don't mind them.
They actually taste great.
Yeah. Especially I buy the ones that are refrigerated and you heat up on the stove.
Love it.
Once you warm the tortilla, it's kind of whatever's in it. Whatever's in the taco is usually delicious if you're doing it right. maybe something to talk about in the future with you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So yeah, I will thumbs up the whole wheat tortilla. Listeners, try it out. I like the refrigerated ones that you heat up on the stove. They're tasty. So for someone that is really focusing in on weight loss, and we've sort of already touched on, we don't need to be so carb phobic necessarily, but for someone who's thinking about weight loss, any tips when they're walking down the bread aisle? Are they different from tips you'd give, the person who's not worried about their weight?
I think a lot of people, especially my clients who have said, I've lost X amount of weight by cutting out bread, they're usually talking about a lot more than just bread. They're talking about pasta, they're talking about cinnamon rolls, they're talking about donuts, maybe hamburgers. So you're naturally going to be cutting out a lot of excess calories that way. Whether or not that was bread to begin with is up for debate.
Okay.
But it is still important to watch how much you have of it in one sitting specifically. So if you do look at your day and breakfast, lunch, and dinner, there's a lot of different types of bread products, and maybe they're more refined bread products, then cutting back on those would be definitely helpful for any type of weight loss or even weight maintenance.
That reminds me of another question actually then. Thoughts on having a sandwich every day at lunch? Is that like, I think when I think of my work day, like a lot of times the easiest thing to do is just make a sandwich, grab a sandwich. But is that too much? Like, should I not be eating a sandwich every day?
I eat a sandwich probably 5 out of 7 days.
Okay, perfect.
So
okay.
I think it's easy, it's quick. As long as you're getting the whole grain option and you're packing it with lean protein and a lot of vegetables, it's a great, well-balanced lunch.
Okay, perfect. Last question I had for you. We did this on the avocado toast episode with you and I loved it. So I wanted to close off kind of doing the same thing again. And so for our listeners who didn't listen to the avocado toast episode, first of all, go listen. Second of all, I asked Kylie to build us her perfect avocado toast. And I was inspired to do the same in this bread episode because, again, when I opened my app, there was a whole section that was like, build your perfect sandwich. And when I clicked it, all the bread options were immediately like white bread options. So I wanted to ask you, since I think a lot of the reason we buy sliced breads for a sandwich, build us your perfect sandwich.
I actually have 2 perfect sandwiches.
Oh,
and it's dependent on the weather outside.
Oh, I like that.
So if it's a cold day, I would love the homemade sourdough option. And I would put the basil pesto on it or a little bit of Italian dressing. And then I would put some smoked turkey, lettuce, tomato, bell peppers, and probably some onion.
That sounds delicious.
Yes. My second go-to, if it's a little warmer outside, a 100% whole wheat bread. I would mix some tuna with Greek yogurt and avocado together, and I would put some pecans and grapes in there, and then top it off with a bunch of lettuce and bell peppers.
Wow, that also sounds amazing.
Yes, it is.
We're recording this right before lunch, so now I'm starving. Both of those sound amazing.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you so much for being on today and kind of hashing out the bread aisle with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who is often wandering down it virtually, as I mentioned, I use an app.
Mm-hmm.
This has been super helpful.
Good. I'm glad. I'm happy I was able to help clear up some things too.
Awesome. It's great to have you.
Okay, Katie. Big takeaways from this bread conversation.
I think my main takeaway is that I have actually been purchasing multigrain bread thinking it's the healthiest option in the aisle. And from after talking to Kylie and checking packages, I really couldn't find any that actually were whole grain in the end. So that's my biggest takeaway.
We've been lied to our whole lives about this. Right?
I've been trusting the label, seeing the word grain, thinking
it's terminology. It's very confusing to the lay people.
Yes,
right?
It's very confusing. You see the word grain and you think, oh, grain must be a complex carbohydrate. No, not necessarily the case. Have to flick the package over. Now I know that. She gave us some real simple tips for quickly looking at an item and saying, I'm picking this up or I'm putting this down. That was my biggest takeaway. How about you, Zach?
Yeah, for me, the tortillas. Wheat tortillas being a recommendation, because I had always heard, oh yeah, you always want to go with corn tortillas.
Yeah.
Like, no matter what taco shop you're at, I actually prefer crispy tacos. That's a whole nother conversation.
Okay.
But
yeah.
if you're at a soft taco shop, right?
Soft taco shop. Okay.
And they say, do you want flour or corn? I'm like, I want flour, but I know I should say corn. So I say, oh, corn, please.
Yeah. Well, so now what are you going to say?
Do you have wheat? Right? Because
Yeah.
I've of course probably seen them before, but I never really thought that was really thought that was like a very like specialized health option. It might still be.
Yeah.
I don't know how like accessible they are to the general public.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I don't know how many restaurants supply them. Like I think if you asked a restaurant, I think these days there's usually a whole wheat or whole grain bread option or bun option. Like if you're getting a burger, a lot of places now there's like a whole grain or whole wheat option. I don't know if there's wheat tortilla options at restaurants yet. I mean,
might be soon, but it depends on what restaurant though.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, I had talked to Kylie about this in the past, and she kind of blew my mind with the wheat tortillas as well. And so I switched to wheat tortillas when we make tacos at home, which is often, at least once a week. I buy the refrigerated ones, so they're like raw, and you cook them on the stove. So they're warm, and then they're like fresh. They're not like the bagged that kind of have that weird flavor, plus they're wheat and healthy flavor. So I will say, if you do it that way, the wheat tortillas actually aren't that bad, in my opinion.
Okay.
Like I enjoy them. Every now and then I'll do the flour ones, but for the most part, I can almost always talk myself into doing the healthier option and picking wheat.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Also, sourdough bread. I've always been a big fan of sourdough bread.
Love sourdough bread.
And hearing her say that it helps with digestion and there were some definite health benefits there, I'm like, great. I'm all about the sourdough.
Yeah, I agree. I also was one of the people at the start of the pandemic who did the sourdough starter thing.
Okay.
To be honest, the bread never worked. The bread part never worked out for me. It's really hard to make bread yourself at home, but I love sourdough. So I was happy to hear that too, because it's nice when something that tastes good and you enjoy also comes with that added health benefit of like, oh, maybe it improves my gut health. I loved hearing that.
Yeah, I think I'll be defaulting to sourdough as often as possible instead of like your traditional burger bun or something like that. Because I like a good patty melt.
Yeah.
Right. And those come on sourdough.
Yeah. True.
So
true.
You have those. You get even sandwiches, even, toast, sourdough toast. So not that that's going to be my only bread. Now, I'm not going to just you should never just take some one fact and like, okay, this is my thing now. But it has encouraged me, as you said, it's something I already enjoy. So, okay, good. I don't have to like give something up or switch something out there.
Yeah.
Which, gives me more of an open mind to like, okay, well, I can switch out for these wheat tortillas.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah, I wonder if sourdough bread would make really good croutons in the air fryer.
Oh, man. I'm going to go home and try that today.
Back to that. It's all I think about when I look at bread options, like the scratch bread.
Can I make croutons of this?
Will this make a better crouton than the one I had last night?
Very good.
Yeah, so that's something to try too, because then it would be a delicious crouton that comes with the gut health benefits. So that was exciting to hear. Was also happy to hear that English muffins are in fact healthier than biscuits. That's often a brunch thing for me.
I'm an English muffin fan myself.
See, I mean, like biscuits for me obviously taste better. But again, like as I try to be healthier in things, I'm like, okay, this is a choice I'm going to make, especially at brunch. I'm trying to make this brunch healthier. I'm going to choose the English muffin over the biscuit.
Well, do you like a real crispy English muffin or a softer English muffin? I'm a more crispy English muffin. So it's not quite a biscuit substitute. It's just a totally different thing to me.
Okay, that's a good point. I think for me, it depends. I like a crispy English muffin if I'm doing like an Eggs Benedict. I like the softer English muffin, back to my peanut butter and jelly obsession. Sometimes for breakfast, I'll still toast the English muffin, but the peanut butter and jelly is like gooey and soft. So if the muffin's a little gooey and soft, it just becomes this like warm, gooey, soft, delicious thing. So I could go either way on the English muffin, being crispy or soft.
Speaking of sandwiches, right? Those couple of sandwiches you described at the end were fantastic.
I'm definitely gonna have to make both. If you like made me pick, I think I would actually pick the tuna one just because it sounded so unique.
Okay, I would pick the other one. I'm just not Mr. Tuna over here.
Yeah,
so,
that's fair. Yeah. That's fair. We eat a lot of tuna, and it's really boring. And the way she described that tuna sandwich, I was like, yeah,
that is, as someone who doesn't eat tuna very often, that is a tuna sandwich I would line up to try.
Yeah. And I'm happy to hear that she eats a sandwich almost every day.
Very, very good to hear. And speaking to our first point at the beginning of the podcast, bread gets a bad rap.
Mm-hmm.
Rap, well, like a sandwich. And it's really about, as it is with everything, really, moderation for one, and what kind of bread are you choosing?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like Kylie really gave us a good perspective, a good guide. When you're walking down that intimidating bread aisle, like we discussed, we can kind of have some guidelines now.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's my favorite part. I do most of my grocery shopping online and curbside now, just because the pandemic started it. And then I was like, well, it's convenient. So I do most of it online. So it is easier to check the ingredients lists now, I think, because back when I used to go into the store, I would stand and stare and flip packages over. And like I said, I was picking multigrain thinking I was still making a healthy option. And I probably wasn't making the healthiest option. So my biggest takeaway really was like flipping it over, looking for the word whole as the first ingredient. I think it's simple advice that literally all of us can do. If it doesn't say whole and your goal is to pick a healthy option, put it down, try another one, rinse, repeat. I will never look at the bread aisle the same again.
All right, Katie, well, let's go ahead and wrap this up, which is a bread-adjacent item that we actually forgot to ask Kylie about, so maybe next time, Katie.
Yep. Oops.
That's going to do it for us this week on the On Health podcast. And we encourage you all to go to our blog at houstonmethodist.org/blog and to share, like, and subscribe to our podcast. New episodes drop Tuesday mornings. So until then, stay tuned and stay healthy.
Houston Methodist Hospital has been named the best hospital in Texas for 11 years in a row by U.S. News & World Report. Houston Methodist Hospital is the #1 hospital in Texas and number 15 in the nation. We are nationally ranked in 10 specialties, the most in the state. For more than 100 years, we have provided you the best and safest clinical care, advanced technology, and patient experience. That's our promise of leading medicine. Houston Methodist, leading medicine.